Hello and welcome to a conversation with myself, Mark Vernon, and Bernardo Kastrup. Bernardo, hi, I'm very excited to speak with you today. Your voice is like clear light coming across my YouTube feed on occasion. You can go down the epicycles with the best of them, but I feel you always keep a clear steer on what this really is all about at the end of the day. So it's a real joy to speak with you today.
Thank you, sir. I'm very happy to be here.
Now look, maybe if I say a little bit about your work and my work, and then maybe we can just sort of put down a few basics that would be helpful for people. But I hope then to push off in various directions, which I think are common interests, but also responses, particularly to conversations you've been having recently with figures like John Vervaeke, Matt Segal. They're people that I've spoken with as well. And so it'd be nice to feed that our dialogue was feeding into that wider network of exchanges as well too, actually.
Sure.
Yeah. But so, I mean, I've recently been reading particularly your books on Jung and Schopenhauer. I should say actually we share a publisher. I've published a book with John Hunt Publishing as well.
Oh, that's how I know your name so well. I thought it's because of British media, but I was thinking I don't get so much British media, but I know you. So that's where it comes from.
Yeah, so I published this book, A Secret History of Christianity, which is really about the ideas of Owen Barfield that we'll come to. Just to give people a snapshot, I mean, your book on Jung is about Jung the metaphysician. So it's saying Jung was not just the empirical psychologist that he often said he was, but particularly latterly, he becomes clearer about whole metaphysics, which is an idealistic metaphysics.
Yeah, there was a whole metaphysical system of thought underlying his psychology, which he was not clear or explicit about all the time. But if you read through his corpus, there's more than enough there for us to be able to reconstruct how he was thinking.
Yeah, it's very, very helpful for doing that. And then the book on Schopenhauer, and in a way, if there were one key move there, it's your observation, his observation that unlike Kant's conclusion that we can't know the thing in itself, because we can know our own interiority, we know that we're made of the same stuff, at least as in its appearance, as the rest of the natural world, we can therefore actually know.
And that dovetails so nicely with Owen Barfield and the idea that what we see are appearances, and that behind the appearances and on the other side of them from us, there is something like us. And that is, of course, Schopenhauer's will.
Yeah. So that sense of something like us, that's actually, I think that's going to be one of the key strands. And maybe just to talk a little bit about Owen Barfield. I mean, I work as a psychotherapist and also have a background, actually my undergraduate degree was in physics. So I have some sense of that at least. And then I moved into areas of theology, and then my PhD was in Platonic philosophy. But Barfield, this chap, Owen Barfield, became really key for me. So he's not so well known, although I wish he was more well known, but he was one of the Inklings, and he was great friends with Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. They both said that he had the best ideas, in fact, and Tolkien once remarked that when he read Owen Barfield, he had to stop teaching all he was teaching and think it all again. And Lewis talked about their oppositional friendship. And the more you read Barfield and then read Lewis, actually, the more Barfield you see in Lewis, I think.
Were they oppositional? Because if I read C.S. Lewis, it doesn't come across to me as contradicting anything Barfield said.
Yeah, no, I think that Lewis sort of follows Barfield, and I mean, Lewis is a genius writer, so that's why he's known. You know, Barfield has got great ideas, wasn't nearly such a good writer, but yeah, you can feel them mutually illuminating each other, I think.
Okay,
yeah,
interesting.
But look, Barfield, in a way, the reason why I picked up on Barfield was partly because you do quote him in your book on Schopenhauer. Maybe I'll just read the quote. I did make a note of it so people can get a feel both for Barfield and also for what interested you. So this is in one of the chapters in your Schopenhauer book, you say, well, in parenthesis, for historically early man. So this is an earlier stage of consciousness in Barfield's terms. There stands behind the phenomena and on the other side of them from me, a represented, which is of the same nature as me. That's what you were just saying. whether it is called manna or by the names of gods and demons or God the Father or the spirit world, it is of the same nature as the perceiving self, inasmuch as it is not mechanical or accidental, but psychic and voluntary. So it has mental qualities and a kind of freedom with the way that it engages with the world. I think that's what Barfield must mean by those last two comments.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, so look, it was partly just a joy for me to read that because of the Barfield reference, but linking it to Schopenhauer as well. Could you just tease out a little bit more of that? Because, you know, Barfield's known for this idea that consciousness has evolved, that, as he puts it there, historically early humanity experienced life very differently from the way we do now. I mean, I think of it broadly as, say, before about 2,500, 3,000 years ago, when you read the literature engage with the myths of that time, it feels like people didn't have a sense of themselves as autonomous individuals in the way that we do now, but rather experience life from the outside in. You know, and so religiosity was all about relating through libations, through sacrifices, through myth and so on, to a kind of external reality that was your prime reference point, really. Whereas over a period of time, that was sort of taken in so that we now naturally think of our interiority as our sort of prime locus, if you like, and then we try and reach out to relate. That you're nodding, so that makes some sense to you.
Absolutely. I think when we read old texts, we make this faulty assumption that the people who wrote that were relating to their arguments and their positions in the same way that we relate to them if we read them today. Like these guys meant what they meant in a literal sense, for instance, and then nothing could be further from the truth. I think in old days, the physical world was interpreted as a symbol, as a set of icons. All the World an Icon, that book of Tom Cheetham about Henri Corbin's philosophy. So they were representations, and they represented something that was immanent in them, but in some sense behind them, that which is represented, which Barfield calls both the unrepresented and the represented. And he acknowledges that he makes this confusion and he doesn't know how to get out of it. But what he means is there is something that is not the representation itself. And that the world of representations, and Schopenhauer used the same word, Vorstellung, in German, which means representation. There's dispute about this. Some people say it should be presentation, but in the meaning that I am attributing to the English word representation, Schopenhauer meant exactly the same thing as Barfield, with appearances. And the appearances point to something beyond themselves, something behind themselves, on the other side of them from us, but immanent in them. So our relationship with the world used to be symbolic, because we knew that we were interfacing with representations or appearances, and there was an extra dimension of depth and mystery behind the appearances. But we've got to a point where we think that the world is now its own meaning, that the representations are the thing in themselves, that there is nothing behind them, there's nothing they represent, they're literal. And that is a unfortunate state of affairs. You may say, well, it's a necessary period in human evolution to become basically mad like this, but yeah, it's where we are today.
Yeah, and so this phrase "saving the appearances," which is one of the titles of Barfield's big books, that amplifies that. So his argument there is that the phrase is an Aristotelian one originally, and Aristotle says that any scientia, any kind of systematic attempt to put together a body of knowledge, has to save the appearances, by which he's separating out a kind of full knowledge, as if any systematic set of thoughts could be a full comprehensive knowledge of things. But what it does do is it successfully transmits, it successfully represents some part of that which is ultimately beyond representation too. And sometimes it's said actually that Galileo's great crime, as it were, at the beginning of the scientific revolution, wasn't coming up with another system of thought. You know, heliocentrism had been around for quite some time. It was known in the ancient Greek world. His sin, if you like, was to say, no, this is the only way, and this is the true reality. It's not just a representation, it's a complete description. I don't know whether, you know, Barfield described that as Galileo's mistake, if you like.
A mistake we have been repeating ever since.
Yeah, and you know, and it's a mistake. This is not just a sort of tit for tat, you know, who's right, who's wrong. It's a mistake because it has real impact upon us. And Barfield talked about how it imprisons us, because what our habits of thought or, you know, ways of trying to engage with the world, participate with the world would be his way of putting it. They actually become walls that imprison us, because they constrain the ways in which we can engage with reality, rather than leading into wider and wider participations with reality.
Absolutely. You see, if you forget that the physical world is just a representation, an appearance, and you engage with it as if it were the noumena, the thing in itself, you kill not only that which is represented by the appearances, because you basically eliminate it from existence, but you kill the appearances, because the meaning of the appearances is to represent, is to indicate, to point to something beyond themselves, immanent in themselves. But if you say the appearances are the thing in itself, then you've killed them too. So you need to save the appearances to recover that extra dimension of depth, meaning, and mystery that our forefathers took for granted, but we've lost it today. And it's unfortunate, Mark, because, you know, modern science and analytic reasoning has already proven, actually mathematically, that the things on the screen of perception, the physical world of objects distributed in space and time, cannot be the world as it actually is. We know that from different and converging lines of argument. From neuroscience, we know that our perceptual states have to be encoded and inferential. They cannot mirror the states of the world, because otherwise the dispersion of our inner states would be unbounded, and we would basically boil up into an entropic soup. We would die. That's the idea. So what we see on the screen of perception cannot be the world as it is in itself. Otherwise, we would die. We know also from evolutionary theory, also a theorem proven recently mathematically, that evolution drives truth through perception to extinction very swiftly, very quickly, because it would be data overload. What we need is a kind of user interface with the world. So what we call the physical world is just the output of measurement on a dashboard of dials. We do not have a transparent window into the world. Evolution hasn't equipped us with that. We would die, we wouldn't survive. All we have is a dashboard of dials, what we call space, time, objects. This is the paradigm of the dashboard. Now, if we had a transparent window into the world, just like pilots, they can look at the dashboard and then look up and see the world as it actually is. But we can't do that, so we think the world is the dashboard. The world is that measurement representation that we've evolved to construct internally. And in saying that, we lose the world. We lose that which is measured, that which is represented.
Yeah, and Barfield summarized it very nicely in one of his essays called about the meaning crisis, where he talked about how the sign of that death that you're describing there is that the more that's claimed to be known about the world, the more meaningless it becomes at the same time. So it's a kind of, because of that uncoupling you're talking about, it leads to this kind of spiral down, even as knowledge itself seems to be increasing.
Yeah, I mean, look, physics is the science of the dashboard. Physics is the study of the regularities of how the dials move with respect to one another. And we've become so good at that we can predict with exquisite accuracy how the dials will move later on. And therefore, we can develop technology that leverages this predictive knowledge. But we forget that those dials are measurements of the actual world outside. They are not the thing in itself. They give us hints, information about the world. So it doesn't, you know, the more you understand how the dials relate to one another, the more you think you have a causally closed picture of the world. But that world is the dials, is the dashboard of instruments. And we forget that all those dials, what they're actually doing is giving us clues about something that is beyond them, behind them, the thing that they are measuring and representing. And that is essentially the dimension of meaning. The world means something quite literally. It means something in the same sense that a written word means something beyond itself. So does the physical world mean something beyond itself. It's a set of signs and symbols. But if we flatten the if we flatten existence by saying that all that exists is that dashboard in front of us, then of course the meaning disappears because we've arbitrarily decreed that it has no meaning. It is the thing in itself. And that is extremely unfortunate because the immediate consequence of that is that behind the physical body, immanent in it and pointed to by it, there isn't conscious in their life, there is nothing because the body is all there is. The body too, our body, is merely a representation of our inner mental states. But if we deny that the world, which is material, like our body, material in a colloquial sense, if we deny that the world represents something behind it, we have to deny that the body represents something behind it. And then we get into this madness of illusionism and eliminativism, the denial of consciousness, which is the so undeniable thing in nature. That's how bad things have gotten.
Yeah, and just to add that Barfield derived his ideas through empirical study. You know, he didn't just sort of dream this up, but he was very interested in words, and he talked about how words have soul, by which he meant they have an inner life too. They're not just, as it were, a flat dashboard with nothing behind them, but the words too communicate meaning to us. It's why we can speak making vibrations in the air, but we hear much more than just the kind of buzz of wind, but we communicate meaning to one another. And that because he realized that words carry meaning, if you track the changes in the meaning of words, you can therefore also track the shifts of consciousness as they've been used over time, which is pointing back to what you were saying about not just reading history as if human beings have always meant the same thing for all time.
Absolutely.
But look, I just to push a bit now, because this theory does have quite big consequences when you start to track it down. And one of the ones that Barfield was very keen on was challenging sort of a principle in modern physics, which is the principle of uniformitarianism, which is the idea that physics laws are the same always everywhere. And so, for example, it's, you know, by inference, therefore you can track back to, say, propose something like a Big Bang, or you can track forward and so propose something like heat death. Now, Barfield felt that that uniformitarianism makes the mistake that the historian makes when they look back and think that human beings have always thought in the same way, you know, and so they weren't just experiencing the world through sophisticated myths, but what they really wanted to become was scientists, and myths are kind of failed science, if you like. Now, but that to challenge uniformitarianism in physics is a big deal. There's actually a conversation that Barfield had with David Bohm once, the physicist, who was, you know, had his own ideas, but was always regarded as a bit of a maverick physicist, if seriously respected. And Bohm actually pointed to Barfield, well, you know, uniformitarianism is already breaking down in modern physics. For example, at the event horizon of a black hole, that's one way of understanding what goes on in a black hole, that the assumption that the laws of physics are the same always and everywhere has broken down at that point. But is that something you've thought about?
Uniformitarianism, to some extent, can be a self-fulfilling prophecy, because people might say, well, if we assume that the laws of nature have been the same all along, then we can calculate precisely that a Big Bang happened 13.8 billion years ago, because we can just play the record back. Well, that's begging the question. You are coming up with the 13.8 billion years number by assuming a uniformitarianism to begin with. And there are many cracks, I think, today, much more than in Barfield's time, in the armor of uniformitarianism. There is a paper that has just been published April this year on the archive. It's not peer-reviewed yet, by Stephen Alexander, well-established, well-known American physicist, in which he argues that the laws of nature, they merely represent the current configuration of a sort of neural network underlying all space and time, which is in the process of learning. The paper is called The Autodidactic Universe, which is fantastic. And by postulating this, that the laws of nature have actually been changing, they represent the current state of learning of the universe, you can solve several qualms in cosmology, like why certain constants are what they are, why the laws are what they are. You can sort of make a bit of progress in making sense of that, if precisely if you give up on the certainty of uniformitarianism. There are theories that postulate, for instance, that gravity was 20% weaker some time ago. We know that even in the standard model of particle physics, the point where it comes together with cosmology, the very first instances after the Big Bang, we know that there is a point in energy and time in which the laws of physics hadn't congealed yet. So at least at that moment, they were not uniform. They hadn't congealed yet. So I think the discussion today, although most people still have the intuition of uniformitarianism, we know that strictly speaking, it's not really holding anymore. We know that on the boundaries, it's kind of loose. So I think today it's taken more as a practical assumption that works under most regiments, but it's not a fundamental reality. The universe is not fundamentally so that the laws of physics are frozen. In practice, we can make that assumption because it works in practice. Just like Newton's laws still work in practice. We can land a satellite on a comet or on an asteroid by using those laws, but we know that they are fundamentally not true. It's quantum mechanics and relativity theory. But we can still make use of them. So I think that's the status today of uniformitarianism. It's a practical assumption that we know it's fundamentally wrong, but it still works most of the time.
I mean, so that's very fascinating that you would say that people know that it's wrong. Physicists would know that it's wrong because, you know, popular physicists, when they write their big history of the universe kind of books, they tend to begin with the Big Bang or something like it and move towards heat death or something like it. But do you think a bit like I know that the Big Bang is routinely questioned now, and even people like Roger Penrose, you know, who does have quite a public profile, he would definitely question the notion of a sort of single Big Bang event at least. But do you think, you know, physicists behind the scenes are saying, look, although we write these fun articles speculating billions of years hence, we kind of know that there's more going on than just a linear projection into a distant future?
Oh, at least in the very first moments of the universe's existences, I think at least there is openness to the idea that the laws of physics at some point hadn't congealed yet. And that's right there in the standard model. So strictly speaking, you can stretch uniformitarianism until 10 to the power of minus 32, I think, since the Big Bang, which is very close to the Big Bang, but not all the way to that singularity moment. It doesn't make sense to talk about that. And also today, look, there are mysteries in physics and in cosmology that we feel all warm and fuzzy about because we've given them a name, we've put a label on them. So it seems like we know something about it, but in fact, we know nothing, like what we call dark energy. Even the word energy, it's just metaphorically used in that label. The universe's expansion is accelerating in a way that it shouldn't, unless there is some other factor, a big one, influencing the evolution of the universe that we know nothing about, and then we just label it dark energy. So we don't really know because our models are not closed. They don't really work out. Quantum field theory has not been reconciled with gravity. We do not have a unified theory. So we know that there is something, well, a few things in our cosmological models that are incomplete or wrong. We know that for sure. So in this context, to say that it's etched in stone in nature that the laws of physics are always constant throughout space and time is at best naive.
It's very interesting you mentioned the dark energy, dark matter, because just a few days ago, actually, there was this new bit of research that came out that seemed to show that dark matter was much more smoothly distributed across the cosmos than the models would imply. And it stood out for me actually because my old physics tutor, Carlos Frank, was one of the lead participants in that project. And the story I like to tell about him is that when I was doing my physics 30 years ago, he had a big poster outside his study saying, "Dark matter, does it exist?" And of course, the poster's still there 30 years later. And it was a nice reminder about the speculative, fascinating, but nonetheless often very speculative nature of what we take to be the hard science of physics.
Look, there is, people don't see it because, in the beginning, these things are only discussed in very specialist groups, like in Foundations of Physics conferences with 60 attendees. That's the forum where these things are talked about. But the idea that what we call the physical universe, to a large extent, is emergent and not a sort of fundamental room, a fundamental scaffolding of nature that is really out there, but we actually take part in constructing what we call the physical universe through our cognitive inferential mechanisms. This idea, which used to be something that only certain niche and sort of far out psychologists would talk about, today is discussed seriously in Foundations of Physics and the work of Markus Miller in the Austrian Academy of Sciences. He says that what's primary is the first person perspective as far as the physical universe is concerned. That what we call the physical universe arises from our inferential cognition. We are constantly making guesses about what is out there. And we get some feedback from a system that goes beyond our ego. And that process, that inferential process, converges to what we call the physical universe. And he can show that statistically, it will converge in the same way for everyone. So we will think that we inhabit the same physical universe. While in fact, that may not necessarily be the case at all. And although Marcus doesn't motivate his theory on the basis of what I'm about to say, to me, the greatest promise of that theory is that it may make sense of what, again, to me, is the most confounding, vexing aspect of physics today, which is the fine-tuning. It drives me mad, the fine-tuning. I wish it weren't true. I wish I could just say nonsense, I can ignore it, but I know I can't. And Marcus' idea, I think, is very promising because it's a very rigorous mathematical way of accounting for the physical universe as an emergent thing from a first-person perspective. And then, of course, it would emerge in such a way as to account for that first-person perspective. You would never inferentially converge to a physical universe that leaves no room for you as a living being. It would automatically configure that thing that emerges in such a way that there is room for you in it, that you can account for your own existence, and therefore fine-tuning of the universal constants that would be sort of a natural statistical convergence of the physical universe, if in fact it is an emergent cognitive guess, an internal dashboard of dials, and not what's really out there, which doesn't deny that there is something out there. It only suggests that what may be actually out there isn't physical in the colloquial way. It's not made of objects with defined mass, position, and momentum.
Yeah, so look, this is very fascinating. And I wonder, do you feel it's fair to, say, take a book like Carlo Rovelli's latest, very well-known cosmologist. He's just written this book called Helgoland, which is about the origins of quantum physics. And he presents, by the end of it, a kind of short summary of his own view, which is a relational view of reality. It's a bit like Indra's net, that what we call space and time is actually just one way of describing the relationship between various, well, he would say still objects in the cosmos. He still, I think, clearly stays on the third person side of things. And this is why I'm wondering whether it could be thought, though, nonetheless, as sort of a halfway house towards the first person description you're outlining there. Because what's also striking to me when I read certainly Helgoland is that consciousness itself is kind of smuggled in at the last minute. Essentially, I think for Rovelli, he would say consciousness is meaningful information to living organisms. So whilst information is exchanged between inanimate objects, and that's the nature of their relationship, it becomes meaningful to living organisms, and that is what we call consciousness. So he sort of, but it feels like a smuggling act at the end of the day. But do you think, I mean, you're sort of nodding, so that seems to make sense, but also do you think that it is nonetheless mainstream physics kind of nudging towards, say, a first person description of things?
So I have to be careful in what I'm about to say, because I don't want to misrepresent Carlo. I was having an email exchange with him yesterday, too deep in the night, or the night before, maybe. No, yesterday, I think. And there are lots of things in the air, so I don't want to misrepresent him. I did write an essay criticizing the philosophical position he takes in his latest book, but as far as his scientific interpretation of quantum mechanics, relational quantum mechanics, I am 100% on board with him. I have been known to defend that view on Scientific American multiple times. Before I continue, another disclaimer, because it's a very sensitive point, because he also told me, yeah, there's people keeping writing me these emails saying that you're portraying relational quantum mechanics as solipsist. And I'm like, I never did that, please. So I don't think even Marcus Miller's view is solipsist. I'm sure it's not. And I'm sure Marcus Miller would say it's not solipsism. We are just saying that the physical world is emergent, but that's not to say that everything is just that emerging physical world. There may be a meta context with meta laws within which we are all immersed. It's just that what we colloquially call physical may be emergent. And I think in this exactly same spirit, relational quantum mechanics is not solipsist. What has made some people think that I claimed that it was solipsist is that in my argument on Scientific American that it was not solipsist, in the beginning of my argument, I try to empathize with the people who think that it is. So I present their arguments and then I proceed to say, but this is not valid because. So if you read only the first part, you would be thinking that I am accusing Ravelli of being a solipsist. No, I've never done that. It was never my intent, at least. And I don't think RQM implies solipsism. But to not imply solipsism, I think you would have to grant that there is something more than what's technically called the observable quantities of physics: mass, charge, spin, momentum. The world cannot be only that, because those quantities are relational. They are not absolute. Those quantities arise from measurement. Before you measure, in other words, before you look at something, it's a bad, not strict metaphor, but before you look at something or make a measurement, that something has no physical properties in the colloquial sense or the technical sense of observables. It doesn't have a weight, it doesn't have a position, it doesn't have speed. These things don't exist. These things are what appears on the dashboard of instruments upon a measurement. Before you measure them, there is something there, but you can't characterize that something as being physical in the way you and I use the word physical, because physicality is the measurement displayed on the dashboard of dials. Before you measure, the dials are showing zero, which doesn't mean that there is no external world. There is something out there that will be measured, but physicality is the position of the dials on the dashboard. So if you understand that physicality is not the bottom layer of nature, there is one layer underneath it. There is what Schopenhauer called the will, Barfield called the unrepresented, Kant called it the noumen. I mean, you can go, Federico Fagin calls nousim. I mean, there are many words for that. But whatever it is, whatever its ontological category, there must be something behind the physicality that we define through physical observable quantities. If you understand and grant that, relational quantum mechanics is not solipsist. And I am with Ravelli all the way with relational quantum mechanics. The point where we sort of part ways, although we are in the process of seeing, can we reconcile our respective views? Is it just a matter of he uses the word physical in a broader sense than I am comfortable with it. So I say it must be non-physical. And he says, no, it's still physical in a certain sense. So it may be just a linguistic disagreement. But I think the majority of people will understand his position in his latest book as saying, It's relations all the way down. All that exists is relations. It's turtles all the way down. It's relations all the way down. I think if interpreted in this manner, I think it's incoherent because it immediately leads to infinite regress, and it is literally meaningless. Because you see, the prototypical example of a relational phenomenon is movement. Movement is not absolute. If I'm sitting on a train, I am not moving with respect to the train. But with respect to somebody standing on a platform, I am moving. So movement is relative. So in a sense, what Ravelli is saying is that the entire physical world is like movement. I am with him there. I agree. But then he says, and there is nothing that moves. And to me, that doesn't compute because it has no meaning. There is no sense in saying the entire world is made of movement, but there is nothing that moves. I think this is not coherent. So yeah, this discussion is going on right now. Let's see where it will go.
It's wonderful that you've been having these exchanges with him and clarifying, and you know, just to stress, you know, in these kind of dialogues, the clarifications are really key because it's that which leads to further illumination.
Sure.
It's not just a kind of respect for someone and not wanting to misrepresent them. I mean, I actually had a discussion with Carlo Rovelli about Dante, because I've written a book on Dante coming out later this year, and he's a great fan of Dante and loves Dante's description of space and time in the Imperium, right at the last bit of the Paradise, because he felt that Dante intuited essentially a relational cosmology, where relationships defined the connections between things, not just a kind of absolute space-time. And that's why he could conceive of what's sometimes called the hypersphere, where centers and circumferences and so on can kind of flip. And when Dante's in the Imperium, he can travel across what he sees in the sort of blink of an eye, because it's a mental kind of traveling rather than a physical kind of traveling. But you see, my conversation with Carlo there was then about, but this is a kind of idealism then. It's an absolute idealism. It's not a subject idealism, as you're saying, because it's not solipsistic.
He will deny that. He will say, no, that's not a necessary implication. He will say that only idealists would think that this is a necessary implication. I think, but again, this is not a pronouncement of Ravelli's view right now. This is my current understanding of where he seems to be going. I think his understanding of what can be called physical is broader than what I personally am comfortable using the word physical with. And what I'm about to say is not a criticism, it's just to illustrate my thinking. You can turn physicalism into something entirely unprovable, entirely unfalsifiable by continuously stretching the meaning of the term. At some point, if you say, well, physicality incorporates pure abstract information, physicality incorporates mental stuff, it's ultimately physical. Yeah, then physicalism is right, because you're stretching that term to a point where it becomes impossible to falsify what you mean by that term. At some point, it will mean anything you want it to mean. So my personal discomfort with what and I'm talking about things Ravelli didn't put out yet, so I'm dancing a difficult dance now. But Ravelli is not an idiot. So on the contrary, I think he's a modern genius in the purest sense of the word, that Renaissance sense of the word. So the criticisms I made of his position, of course, are not entirely new to him. These are things he's been computing. His appeals to Nagarjuna, for instance, seem to be a little more sophisticated than I gave him credit for. But what I sense from that conversation is that he's stretching the sense of the physical beyond the observable physical quantities that we normally associate physicality entirely with. If something does not have inherent mass, charge, momentum, spin, frequency, amplitude, none of the quantities we call physical, then in what sense can we say that it is still physical? Is this a fair linguistic move, or is it misleading? You see what I mean?
Yeah, no. I mean, the thought that's coming to my mind is in relation to panpsychism, which again can sometimes seem like a kind of last gasp of a kind of materialism, stretching what normally counts as physics and a material account of reality to a limit. I mean, a good example of this is if people wanted to read it, I felt, was an essay that Galen Strawson, the philosopher and great advocate of panpsychism, published in the TLS, which is available online. And although he's insisting it's a form of, well, he might say naturalism, just to throw in another word, but even though he would insist it is a form of naturalism, by the end of it, you're thinking, I don't know if I can tell the difference anymore. And just in parenthesis, I know that Carlo Rovelli is very dismissive of panpsychism. He sort of dismisses it almost in a line in this new book. So it shows you the sort of subtleties that you must try and wrestle with in these debates.
I am very sympathetic to his position towards panpsychism. Now, we have to be careful again, because there are all kinds of panpsychisms, and they can be radically different. But I think what most people mean when they simply use the word panpsychism is constitutive panpsychism or bottom-up panpsychism, the idea that elementary particles have fundamental mentation of their own. And as you said, it's a way to stretch physicalism, because it still grants the fundamental existence of matter, but it adds experience as one extra property or essence of matter. So next to mass, charge, momentum, there is also experience, which may be just an extrinsic property, or maybe the intrinsic side of those other physical properties. But what you see is that the structure of matter is preserved, and the fundamental existence of that structure is preserved. And what the constitutive panpsychist then does is to just throw consciousness as an extra element to the reduction base. In other words, it doesn't explain anything. It just provides an excuse to not need to explain something by labeling it fundamental. Now, I think that is a bit of a cop-out, although I have enormous respect for Galen. By the way, I consider Galen not only somebody who influenced me, but somebody I learned a whole lot from. I look up to Galen. But I think that's one bad element of panpsychism. Another one is that it's physically incoherent, because it assumes elementary subatomic particles to be real things with defined spatial boundaries. And we know that if we are to have any hope of some grand unification theory, we have to go in the direction of quantum field theory, which tells you that particles are no such things. There are no elementary subatomic particles. There are only excitations of quantum fields, which are spatially unbound. And there are, in the last count, 17 of them, and we hope to sort of unify them all plus gravity in a super unification theory. But however that goes forward, we know almost with absolute certainty today, Bohmian mechanics is still there, in a corner there. It's not taken seriously, but it's still alive. But short of that, we know for sure that there are no such things as elementary subatomic particles with fundamental spatial boundaries. There are only ripples in the quantum field. And you can say where a ripple is. You can say there's the ripple. You can attribute physical properties to it, speed, direction, height, breadth, but that doesn't mean that you can lift the ripple out of the lake. The ripple is just the lake in movement. In exactly the same way, every elementary subatomic particle is the quantum field in movement. So the panpsychist would have to attribute consciousness to the quantum field, but then it would be spatially unbound. And then you would have 17 universal consciousnesses, and you wouldn't be able to account for the fact that I can't read your thoughts right now, and presumably you can't read mine, because now this panpsychist consciousness is not spatially bound. It is now spatially unbound. So I think panpsychism just doesn't do it.
I can hear the word dissociation in your mind, even if I can't telepathically discern it. But I want to get there. But let's just do a sort of half step towards a bit the other way that evolution is used, which is in the evolutionary theory of Darwin, because I think that you're saying this actually, and you've said it already in our conversation now, but one of the things that interests me is how evolution may not just be driven by survival, but may actually be driven by participation with the natural world as well. And so in terms of the dashboard analogy, I guess that would mean that it's not just the dashboard disconnected from reality, but actually is transmitting an aspect, at least, of reality. So what I wanted to ask, though, more directly was, could you can you imagine other drivers in evolutionary theory? Just to pick this up and say a little bit more, the way I got it was actually from Barfield again, and the discussion about the evolution of language, which is a kind of dashboard. Because what the query there is whether Darwinian accounts can really present a full, rich picture of how language evolved. So this would be the idea that our deep ancestors, or maybe even, you know, other hominins, first of all, kind of pointed at, say, a banana and kind of went or something, and then, you know, gradually this became the word, and then syntax and grammar and so on evolved. Now, this is a genuine problem in standard evolutionary theory, how to account for that. I think you can summarize the problem as basically language already needs to be shared by everybody in order to work. It's very hard to know how it kind of gets going piecemeal from the bottom up. And just to throw in a name about someone who does know these things, this is someone, I've talked about these things with a chap called Simon Conway Morris, who's professor of paleobiology at Cambridge and is a sort of secret Barfield reader. He's come out in public about it, so I'm not giving anything away. But he wonders whether what you really need to account for language is a sense that, well, one way it's sometimes talked about is it's actually related to music, that language is actually a kind of music, and that music is something that arrives from our participation with the world around us and becomes more and more rarefied, so that the instrumental value of language is where it is an end product, not the beginning product. Now, this also means that that language doesn't just, as it were, provide us with a dashboard to kind of survivally get through the world, but also takes us back into a fuller connection with the world as well, so that we feel ourselves to be porous with reality and not split off in solipsistic ways. Now, again, I thrown a lot perhaps there, but does that make some sense to you?
There's a lot there, Mark. And this is a place where I really feel that I have to be very careful in how I use words, not to be misinterpreted, because you touched on a lot of critical points there. Look, I don't think that the post-Enlightenment epistemic values like logical consistency, coherence, empirical adequacy, Aristotelian logic, Aristotelian axioms of logic, all that, I don't think that that is the ultimate set of epistemic values, because it focuses on just one mental faculty of a monkey evolved on a probably common planet on a very common galaxy. Who are we to think that our epistemic values are sufficient to give us an overview of everything that is salient in nature? Of course not. So there is more going on than what we call logical or consistent or plausible. There are translogical things happening in nature. So acknowledge that. But immediately after acknowledging it, I also say to you that it is useless to engage in cultural discussions unless we sort of, for now, in this moment, in this juncture of history, we still stick to the post-Enlightenment values. The only valuable alternative to that is direct insight, which is ineffable. And if you have a direct insight, you're no longer worried about explaining or being explained something. You've been there, you've seen it. Explanations no longer matter. But then you're also not engaging in discussion. At best, you're pointing, you're helping people see that directly too. So insofar as we are engaging in a cultural level discussion, I think we have to stick to the post-Enlightenment values, and therefore we have to stick to Aristotelian logic, empiricism, and all that. Within this concession, within this limited framework, I would say that evolution has no other driver but survival. However, you can survive better, not only by competing better, but by cooperating better. So there are many examples in nature of cooperation, commensalism, there's all kinds of things. And we know now that evolution, although it is driven by survival, insofar as we can ascertain, that survival doesn't mean that you have to be the strongest one and kill everybody else. That survival may mean that, even as a weak one, you may be a link in a big chain of cooperation that will ensure that you survive. For instance, we eat cows and pigs and chickens. But evolutionarily, these three species are the most successful in the animal world, aside from us, because we make sure that there are lots of them, precisely because they're weak. So we can control them and we can eat them. So there is this cruel facet to evolution as well. So I wouldn't be comfortable saying that there is another driver to evolution but survival. I just think that the implications of this survival are much richer than we normally take them to be if you're not actually studying the subject. My criticism of evolution, just one more point. My criticism of evolution would be that in the same breath that people say evolution by natural selection, they also say through random mutations. Now, this latter part, we have absolutely no empirical evidence that the mutations are random. To have that, you would need to have a more or less complete record of all mutations in history, even or particularly the ones that were not selected for, and then run a randomness check on them. There are computer algorithms that can do randomness checks and then verify that the mutations prior to being selected or not, they were random. But it would be a fantastic thing. I mean, it's completely impossible to run this test. The data is not there. So to say in the same breath and with the same level of certainty that evolution happens through natural selection, there's plenty of evidence for that. Through random mutations, no. For the latter, there is no evidence. We don't know. Science is about studying yet undiscovered patterns and regularities in nature. To declare that those mutations are random is basically to declare that there are no patterns and regularities in them. This is anti-scientific. This is pronouncing that there is nothing to be discovered there before you can know anything. So that is my peeve against many spokespeople of evolution, that they take this randomness to be a fact, which it's not. Maybe, but not as far as we know.
So look, let me see whether I can put together an argument just to sort of push back a little bit on that. For one thing, it seems to me that science doesn't just rest on the post-enlightenment values of consistency, coherence, and so on, because it's got to get its ideas from somewhere, you might say. You know, imagination, intuition. To put it in more psychological terms, there's propositional knowing, but there's also dispositional knowing, which someone like John Vervaeke would articulate and expand in all sorts of ways. And so they're still active, if not so much talked about in post-enlightenment points of view. And if they are active in our science, by analogy at least, I don't mean this to be literal, but by analogy at least, might there be a kind of, you might say, kind of playful aspect in evolution as well? I'm thinking there particularly actually of the work that Robert Bellah did, the American sociologist who wrote this tremendous book before he died called Religion in Human Evolution. And broadly what he argues there is that in human evolution, being offline, as he puts it, probably mattered as much as being online, by which he meant that what people did around the campfire might have mattered quite as much as what they did when they were going hunting. And he draws on this notion of play in the richest sense, which it, broadly speaking, means, or one way of defining it would be to say it's occupying those forms of consciousness that are much more dispositional, participative, exploring without purpose, seeing what is revealed and so on. And he thinks that was very key in the development of, well, music, ritual, language, and so on. It's part of the reason why I got onto it, to try and flesh out Barfield's ideas. But maybe, you know, there is more space in the theory of evolution with these ideas coming in that might then also addressed your query about randomness there, because as it were, the generator of survival possibilities isn't just random mutation, it is some kind of participation with the wider natural world.
I acknowledge that. The moment we say it may not be random, we are opening the doors for other possible drivers. Strictly speaking, I acknowledge that. I sympathize a lot with what you're saying. When I see the way certain birds look or the songs they sing, it's like there is more here than just survival. I feel that intuition. Because we also run the risk of turning evolution itself into an unfalsifiable theory. Because you see, if the bird is very, very colorful, oh, that was selected for because it attracts the females. If the bird is gray and dab, oh, it was selected for because it's not seen by the predators. So you can always come up with an evolutionary speculation to sort of defend any observation. So we cannot stop there. We have to go into genetic studies, and we have to think this through more carefully and avoid turning evolution into a unfalsifiable theory. Famously, Daniel Dennett, some 10 years ago or more, was working on an evolutionary explanation for humor, which seems like, you know, a great challenge. Why do we find certain things funny? And he suggested that it was a way the brain found to reward itself for doing some drab, monkey-like functions. Okay, maybe. So I intuitively sympathize with what you're saying. You know, when I am on holidays in the mountains and I look around and I see the richness of life and the trees and the birds and the interactions of life, it's something within me screams that there is more to it than just survival. But if you push me against a wall and put a gun to my head and saying, can you defend this? I would say, no, I cannot defend this intuition. So against a wall, I would say only survival because I don't know how to objectively defend an alternative under post-enlightenment values, which doesn't mean that in my own inner life, that's all that exists. No, there's another part of me that you will not see me expressing because I don't know how to defend it. But there's another part of me who sympathizes a lot with what you said. I see a bird of paradise singing and dancing, and I go like, really? Just survival? Is there no play here?
Yeah, I
Anyway.
mean, I completely take the point about standards of proof. But maybe we should be a bit freer. I mean, you know, your talk about watching the birds, it reminds me of Darwin writing about Argus pheasants in The Descent of Man, for example, and feeling that the female Argus pheasant has an aesthetic sense. She's not, as it were, just looking indirectly for, well, Darwin didn't have genes, of course, but, you know, as it were, for the strongest genes in the display of tail feathers. There's a lot more going on, and then you realize that animals have their own characteristics and they differ from each other, and they make choices and seem to operate in the world because they're individuals as much as just because they're one of a species. So I don't know, maybe we maybe need to write, sort of talk about these things in two ways. There's the kind of strict empirical sort of attempting to find proof, and then there's the more I think it's more than just speculative, because it's speculative in the true sense, actually, that it's trying to see what we see more clearly, not just, as it were, make things up and propose things for their own sake. It really is trying to connect with what's actually observed and factor that in as well, not just live from the abstractions.
Yeah. So in that spirit, what I think we could speculate about is that I think every living organism is conscious. It has mentation. Even paramecium and planaria. Planaria learn, by the way, how to navigate a maze. And if you cut off their heads, they grow a new head that still remembers how to navigate the maze. So there are some funny things going on now in research. But if we understand that every animal is minded, and if we understand mind not as an epiphenomenon of matter, which I don't think it is, and I think there's plenty of very good analytical, rational reasons and evidence to say that it's not that it's something primary in nature, not in a panpsychist sense, but in another sense, then if mind is primary and it has some primary dispositions, archetypal dispositions, if you want to speak Jungian language, and those archetypal dispositions manifest in the mind, in the inner life of every animal in one way or another, then those animals' preferences will impact selection. If a female has an aesthetic sense, then that female will prefer a very colorful male, and therefore the genes of the colorful males will be passed on and survive. So the driver is still survival as far as what's going on in the objective sense, but the subjective preferences of the animals may influence what actually survives or not. And those subjective preferences may be fundamental and not themselves a result of selection. So right there is a way where you can say, you know, non-evolved fundamental archetypal dispositions in mind manifest through animals directly impacting the criteria for survival. because subjective preferences and dispositions now determine who mates with who, where do they live, and what they prefer to eat. So you have these primary mental dispositions playing into this game of survival. It is still survival, but it's very colorful survival now because it has a fundamental mental quality to it.
Yeah. Now, look, you mentioned there how mind is not an epiphenomenon of matter, and you've made this case very brilliantly in lots of other discussions. You know, if people want to hear that, then have a good look around. But I wonder whether we could just maybe nudge in a direction that is still connected to that, which is this whole area of idealism, absolute idealism, if that's a good enough way to capture it, and talk about God. Now, again, with lots of immediate provisos, because the word God means 1,000 things to 1,000 people and is as likely to mislead as it is to illuminate, therefore, because it's culturally loaded. I mean, just maybe to kind of nail that a bit, am I right in thinking that a preferred expression for yours is mind at large?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's more technical, although it's not as poetic. So if you ask, you know, when I'm talking to my girlfriend, which word do I use the word God. But she knows what I mean and I know what she means. So if I'm giving an interview, I don't know what the audience will, how they will interpret it. So I tend to be careful about it, yeah.
Yeah. So look, what I wanted to do, if you've had time to sort of like put the God program in, as it were, the mind at large program in, having talked about quantum physics, having talked about evolutionary biology, is to move on a bit to that. And I mean, maybe a good way of doing this is if I put a kind of classical theistic description of God to you, and let's see kind of where that goes. And I'm thinking partly actually in relation to the conversations which you've recently had with John Vervaeke and Matt Segal, and in a way wanting to defend a classical view of theism against, say, a process view. But let me just sort of describe what I mean first and see where you go. I mean, one way of putting it would be that someone like Thomas Aquinas, he would say that God in God's self is what he calls actus purus. It's like pure act. Everything is realized. Everything is fully expressed in being. But it feels that people often read from that therefore God is kind of static, unchanging. You know, if God's already perfect, then there can't be any more perfections going on. So God must be static. But I think that Aquinas doesn't feel that implication follows. I mean, I really have tried to tease this out, partly again from my reading of Dante, because what's very striking about Dante in the Beatific Vision, right at the end of the Divine Comedy, is that, as he famously puts, you know, he's spinning perfectly with the love that moves the sun and the other stars. This is a dynamic vision, actually. It's not a static vision. So it kind of raises the question of how you can conceive of a perfect state of being that's not static. And, you know, there are a number of ways you can do this. One would be to remember that when we're talking about mind at large, the divine, that which is as well on the other side of the dashboard, you often have to resort to negations. You know, so people would say God is invisible. That's not saying anything positive about the divine. It's just saying whatever God is not visible. You know, immortal, not saying anything positive. Whatever God is not mortal. And similarly with this word, the sort of slightly fancier way of saying unchanging or static would be immutable. That it's not saying anything positive. It's just saying whatever God is, we can say that God doesn't change in the way that we normally mean it anyway. And two thoughts that might unpack it a bit. One is to use a nice Aristotelian distinction, I think, where Aristotle talks about two kinds of change. And one is a kind of change that involves external forces. You know, when you're acted upon, you change. Now, whatever God is, God can't be such a person, a creature, a being, because, you know, God would be the sum total of anything. There's no outside the divine to act in that way. So this leads to Aristotle's second kind of change, which is an internal change, whereby any change is, well, the nice Latin word, which has a modern resonance, is that God is an automobile. Everything that happens within the divine being is fully and completely and wholly determined from within the divine being. So hence God is automobile. You know, when we get into our automobiles, we actually misuse the word because, of course, we get into the mobile to make it move, to make the car move. The automobile is not automobile at all. It doesn't do anything unless it's got a driver. But no, so that would be one way of trying to conceive of how a perfect being can still change. And, you know, maybe the kind of analogues in human experience would be, I don't know, say something like the artist. I was recently looking at the new David Hockney exhibition here in London. And, you know, there's this kind of blaze of his depictions of the spring in Normandy. And they're like variations on a theme that have sort of sprung from his imagination. Now, it's not a perfect analogy because, of course, he's looking at the Normandy spring and drawing his yellows and greens and blues and so on from that. But it did make me think that maybe God's creativity is a bit like the artist's creativity. That is one, you can see how it has a kind of, the collection makes sense as a whole, even whilst you can drill into the particular picture and see the variety that's in that particular picture. It's something about how the universal maybe comes together in the particular, and the particular is fractal of the universal. Now again, you're nodding, I've said probably quite a lot again, but that's making some sense to you.
You have a talent to make fireworks start popping in my head, so I don't even know where to to begin. I think when we look at the scholastics, is it fair to say that Aquinas started the scholastics? Would you be comfortable with that?
Yeah. I mean, you know, scholasticism
but
is just with the provisos normally used in a derogatory sense because it did go downhill from Aquinas, you might say. But when he was at it in the 13th century, it's doing pretty well, I'd say. Yeah, because it was dialogical. That was the point, you know. That's originally what it meant. You know, he would say, someone says this, someone says that. Well, maybe I would say this, as it were, coming up with a third point of view, and that seems to me to be a very good way of talking about these things.
Okay, so the first comment I wanted to make is to highlight that how words are used by this, or were used by the scholastics, and maybe all the way to Spinoza. We have to be very careful in their use of words. For instance, even Spinoza, when he uses the word perfection, what he means is completeness. So, you know, you have to be very careful in that. Or the scholastics, when they use the word substance, they used it as a translation from the Greek ousia, which has an unambiguous meaning that is a lot more strictly defined than the way we use the word substance. Like, oh, the substance of my table is wood. Well, that's not at all what the scholastics meant by substance, that which stands under as the essence of something, an irreducible essence. So when we talk about, you know, perfection, is it dynamic? Is it not? Is it static? Is it not? We have to understand how those people were thinking and how they were using the words. I mean, even pre-scholastic philosophy, if you go back to John Scotus Erigena, that John Vervaeke was referring to, 8th century or 9th century?
Yeah.
The Irish monk that brought knowledge of the classics back into Europe after the barbarian invasions. He introduced all that. Even he had this funny categorization of things. There is that which is non-created but creates, that's God. Then there is that which is created and creates, that's the forms or the archetypes. Then that which is created but doesn't create. And then that which is neither created nor does it create. And that's God again. So God is both the most dynamic you can conceive of, because it has never been created, it only creates. But God is also the endpoint of the telos of evolution, which is that which is neither created and doesn't create, nor create. So you see how those guys were thinking in a way that I'm sure it had absolute logic sense to them. And I think if we read them again carefully with an open mind, 4 or 5 times, we can understand in what way exactly, in what sense it made sense to them. But with a casual read, that we are in for all kinds of pitfalls. So in that spirit, what I would offer to you is the following. we have, as 21st century people, to keep in mind that there is a difference between what exists, natura naturata, of Spinoza, what is already expressed, and the potentials that are expressed in time or not. And we have to keep in mind that although we have this materialist influenced mind, that we tend to think of existing only those things that are already expressed, and therefore they exist by virtue of having been expressed. And we tend to think that potentials alone are nothing, they don't exist. But we forget that the potential for something is not nothing. The potential for something is the ability for there to be an expression at some point. Potentials are pregnant. They are incredibly rich because they are the potentials for everything that can possibly come into expression. They are not nothing. So in that sense, I would say God is static because whatever potentials it has are a function of what it is, and it cannot be something that it is not. You see? So all inherent potentials are in God. And in that sense, it's complete. And if I say complete under Spinoza's vocabulary, I would say God's perfect because he's complete in potentiality. It has all the potentials for what can be. But I think the expression of those potentials are the dynamism of nature. Nature is dynamic. Nature is going somewhere. So obviously God is not content because somebody who is content does nothing. You just sit there enjoying life or enjoying your conscious in your life. That the universe seems very active, very violent, supernovae exploding everywhere, black holes, dragging entire galaxies into nothingness. Things are changing. But I think all those changes are expressions of potentials that were there eternally, and I would say from the beginning, but no, they're there outside time because they are aspects of what God is. Whatever God is, they are aspects of it. So God is complete in potential, but not content in expression. I would say it's dynamic in expression.
Yeah, so this is one of the areas that draws me and the more traditional theist in me wonders about this business about God. You put it slightly jokingly, but God not being content. It's kind of like, why does God create? You might say, if God is this complete being, then what's the advantage? Would be another way of
Complete
putting
in
it.
potentialities.
Yeah, well, yes. So what I wonder whether there might be another way of putting it though. So rather than it being thought, because this is the sort of process thought, the Whitehead idea that those potentialities need to be manifest in order to be fully realized, and so as it were, creation, the creator depends upon the creation in some way. Now you can argue the extent of that risk, you might say, for God in creating, and you've alluded to also to the problem of suffering in talking about the violence that's both in the cosmos at large and of course in living creatures as well. Just to acknowledge that, but what I wonder is whether there's other ways of thinking about this, that maybe around ideas of freedom or around ideas of delight. Again, it's more dispositional than propositional, I think. And the way that I might understand this is that rather than God needing anything, there's a kind of, well, the Platonic way of putting it would be talking about an emanation, a kind of overflow, that you might say that it's in the nature of infinity to continually pour out of itself. And so it's something about the nature of the divine rather than something that is not quite fully realized in the divine, that therefore creation offers back to the divine, you might say.
If you look at a living being, they move, they act when there is some break in the level of comfort or contentment. If they are hungry, they go eat. If they're thirsty, they go drink. If they're frisky, they look for a partner. When they are satiated at all levels, they stop and do nothing. They chill out, they rest, they nap. Um, so to me, this is a big hint regarding a correlation between a conscious inner state and how that inner state is visible on the dashboard we call the physical world. If the inner state is not one of satiation and contentment, that presents itself, that inner state presents itself in the physical world in the form of appearances or representations as moving physical systems, physical bodies. And for me, that's an empirical hint that sort of surrounds us. All life seems to have this. You may say, oh, sharks never rest. Or they never rest because otherwise they don't breathe. So even the fact that they don't rest attests to what I'm saying. They need to breathe. So they are never content because they can't inflate lungs. They have to make water pass through their gills by actively moving. That's why they never rest. And for me, it's difficult to not take this empirical evidence as a tremendous hint to the notion that, mind at large, whatever mental life underlies the universe as a whole, it is moving. So I find it difficult to consider it satiated and content. But you could say that it is God's nature to not be satiated and content. And then we sort of merge our point of view. You're saying dynamism is because it's God's nature. And then I could go along with you insofar as I would say, well, then it's in God's nature to not be satiated and content. Something is breaking that absolute satisfaction, comfort, and easiness. Because the matter that constitutes the inanimate universe as a whole, it's the same kinds of atoms and force fields that constitute biological bodies. So if the matter in biological bodies move when inner life is, oh, I'm not content, then the matter of the universe as a whole is moving. To me, that's a hint, well, there is some degree of non-contentment. And to be honest with you, Mark, I think it's not the reason why I think it's true. But if I satisfy myself that I consider it true, I think there are very positive consequences of it, which is that our lives have meaning. Because if God is in discomfort and it's expressing that discomfort through me and you, then our lives have meaning, have an ultimate telos, an ultimate divine purpose. Something is trying to find its way to comfort through us, through our own actions, thoughts, insights, metacognitive ability, self-knowledge. These may be vehicles to divine comfort. I mean, what more meaning could there be?
Yeah. It makes me think that maybe we do need some polarities here. Actually, we do need contraries, to use the William Blake expression. So the psychologist in me, psychotherapist in me, for example, as you were talking there, I went to attachment theory. One of the best attested theories in modern psychology, psychotherapy, and one way of expressing what showed up in that was that actually the thing that certainly the human child, and the experiments were done on monkeys, and it seems to be the case with monkeys as well, to live, to survive, they actually need the place of security. They need the place of rest where they don't have to worry about moving in order to feed and so on. So these experiments were done on the monkeys, and they went to the comfort place in the cage as much as they went to the place, well, more actually than the place where they would feed. And similarly, we know through attachment styles now that the young baby that is not able to rest actually is going to struggle much more in future life. Because they feel insecure and they can't venture into movement. It just all feels far too scary. And maybe, if that is a bit like you're doing there with the empirical hint, maybe that would be a nudge to the other polarity in terms of the divine, which would be something like God needs to be utterly transcendent, in Eugenia's phrase, to be the uncreated uncreator. in order to be completely immanent, and freely so. And it's a bit like the parent with the child, in a way. The parent needs to be, at least in principle, or at least in part, completely, in a way, unconcerned or outside of the child's cares in order to deliver to the child's cares. Because if the parent starts to feel it can't deliver the child's cares, or more, even worse for the child, needs the child in order to be a parent, that quite quickly in attachment theory spirals into problems that you can then sort of find in later life. The child that has had to parent a parent is going to suffer later on. It hasn't, in Donald Winnicott's phrase, it hasn't had the space within which to play, and so develop itself as a personality, as an individual. So maybe that would be another empirical case, but that nudges at the opposite polarity, that we need rest as much as we need movement in order to survive. And so maybe those two elements are in the divine as well.
I'm totally with you on this. I think we tend in recent centuries to be very naive about the intrinsic polarities that are immanent in the whole of nature. We tend to think in terms of those guys are pure evil and those guys are pure good. No, there's good and evil in everybody, because these polarities are expressed fractally at every level of nature. So I have no problem with what you say. I mean, we all need to sleep. Turns out that even planaria, which have no nervous system, need to sleep. This is research that came out this year, very fresh. So even our theories of sleep as something related to more developed nervous systems that require some sort of house cleaning of the neurotransmitters or whatever, even those theories are now sort of on shaky ground, because there you go, there is an animal with no nervous system, no spine, and it too needs to sleep. So I am with you. These polarities are immanent in the whole of nature. So with the same enthusiasm that I defended the position that God is restless, with the same enthusiasm, I would say, well, but there is also a need for resting in pure being, in God, because we see those things happening. So my original point was to say that this contentment of resting pure being is not the only fundamental thing going about. So I want to precisely highlight the polarities. And I think today we are so naive about polarities that it leads to very dangerous self-images and dangerous situations in the world, because you see, it is precisely the person who wants to conform to a fictitious ideal of pure good, summum bonum, to never sin and to hide its own dark side from him or herself all the time. That's the person who will pull out an AR-15 and kill 30 in the mall. Because if you are not relating to your own shadow sides, to your own repressed polarities, in some way, not giving them free rein, this is precisely what I don't want to happen, that we give free rein to these harmonious aspects of the polarities immanent in us. If you don't relate to them in some way, if you don't acknowledge their right to exist, not their right to run amok, their right to be there, their right to be part of you, if you don't acknowledge it and relate to them in some sense, that's when it comes back and takes control of you. And then you will run amok. And to some extent, if you see, and you're a theologian, if you see how Christianity, I can't say about the evolution of Christianity, but if you see how our idea of God changed from the Old to the New Testament, I mean, the God of the Old Testament is not very thoughtful. As Jung put it, he can't consult his omniscience very well. The devil was much better at it. The devil was a lot more metacognitive. The devil was much more aware of itself than his father. And he tried to help his father develop this metacognitive awareness by being effectively the court's prosecutor, but he was a member of the entourage of God. And what happened to Job sort of illustrates this, quote, unconsciousness of God, in the sense of lacking meta-consciousness, metacognitive awareness. And then leading with Christianity to the summum bonum, in which God is pure good and is fully metacognitive, and everything is planned out. I think this transition has opened space for a relatively naive view of morals and view of ourselves, particularly in places like the US. I don't know whether it's because it's in fact more exacerbated in the US or because US media makes it more visible than in other places. I don't know. But you see this a lot, this denial of the shadow, this denial of the polarities, which is naive and dangerous. This what Hillman, James Hillman, called the cult of innocence in the US, the idea that it's a bad thing to become mature, to think in a more nuanced, deeper, and mature way. That's bad. You have to be innocent like a child. There's good and there is evil. You know, this cult of innocence, I think, is very dangerous, and it to some degree it goes hand in hand with the evolution of Christianity and the summum bonum God, as opposed to the God with two faces, the God of polarities that you see in the Old Testament, a more tribal, unconscious God.
And now the fireworks are going off in my mind now, because there's so much in all that. I mean, I think that Hillman's right about the kind of poor fixation, as he put it, I think, as well in the US. But I think what's happened there is something a bit different. That it's partly the degeneracy of certain forms of Western Christianity that have become fixated on the one person of Jesus, and I think that leads to a kind of immature religiosity. That, you know, is wedded to peak experiences or something like that. Now, you know, that would take a lot of defending. I don't want to offend people unnecessarily, but the bigger point would be the engagement perhaps with Jung here, actually, because I think one of the things that Jung didn't have was a fully blown idea of the evolution of consciousness. He knew that people in different cultures have different qualities of consciousness, and particularly he realized that indigenous people have a different quality of consciousness to ours, without the sense of the individual in particular. But I think what he didn't quite get to, and you know, you've read his works, I know, as well, so I'm happy to be stand corrected, but he didn't quite join the dots on that front. And so he's inclined to read the God of the Old Testament against the God of the New, like in the book of Job, rather than see them as different moments in the evolution of human consciousness perceiving the divine. You know, so you have to look quite hard in the Old Testament, for example, the Hebrew Bible, to find full-blown monotheism. It only comes in fairly late passages like Deuteronomy, Isaiah, you know, the most recent bits of the Hebrew Bible. And monotheism emerges, and you know, the Christian account of that would be becomes kind of crystalline in the one person ascribed to Jesus, who is both fully human and fully divine. As it were, his I amness as a human being could mirror the divine I amness, the divine monotheism, and so consciousness could, you know, become capable of perceiving monotheism in its fullest extent. So for me, that takes me more in a kind of Trinitarian direction, actually, where the polarities don't just both need to exist to be complete in themselves, but they themselves also push to a third perception, you know, which you might call the Godhead or whatever, however you want to describe it. But when you have an account of the evolution of consciousness, that I think produces quite a different reading of, say, things like the book of Job.
I agree with you. Jung didn't elaborate on the evolution of consciousness as much as his pupils did. There is a book by an Israeli Jungian called The Evolution of Consciousness. What was his name? I can't find it immediately. There's too much going on behind me. But he wrote the preface for that book. And in the preface, you can sense that Jung wishes he were the one that wrote that book. If you know what I mean. There's a part of him like, oh, it had to be me to write this book, but I couldn't, or it's too late for me, so I'm happy that this other guy wrote.
Just in parenthesis, I'd love to get the details of that book. I don't think I know it actually, but maybe do it afterwards and I can put it in the notes below.
The problem is I don't have any structure in the way I put books on my shelves.
I'll chase it for you later, if I may, and then I can add it below the line.
I could say it to you right now, so the audience would catch it, but maybe you can put it in the description of the video later on. I will mention it to you. Having said that, Mark, in answer to Job, Jung talks explicitly about the Old Testament and the New Testament expressing a change, an evolution in the human relationship with the God image in the unconscious. So he does explicitly say that that's what he's seeing. It's not just one versus the other. He's seeing a sort of a change, a gradual change, an evolution. He mentions Old Testament figures that prefigure Jesus, both as expressions of the same archetype of completeness, the self with big S. So Jung did have a sense for all this as an expression of the evolution of human consciousness. But I concur with you, he did not elaborate it in any substantive way. Answer to Job is a very short, very intense book. I think it's the most significant of Jung's work in terms of metaphysics and, a discussion about what nature itself is. But it's not a treatise like his Israeli pupil wrote while Jung was still alive towards the end of his life.
Yeah, I mean, it is a book of genius in the sense that it stirs up all sorts of spirits and thoughts, and it is hugely worth reading. We won't get into the whole debate with Father White and Privatio Bonum and all that, because I'm conscious we've been speaking for an hour and a half, and I want to get on to dissociation.
Okay.
I couldn't let you not talk about that as a psychotherapist. Now, could you want to just sort of summarize the role of dissociation in your ideas for people that aren't aware of that?
So there are three key problems in metaphysics today, in analytic philosophy. If you are a materialist, you can't account for how the qualities of experience can be deduced from physical parameters. That's the hard problem of consciousness. If you are a panpsychist, you can't account for how fundamentally distinct fields of subjectivity can combine to form a seemingly unified higher level subjectivity, like what I'm experiencing right now. That's the combination problem. If you are an idealist, there is the so-called decomposition problem, because an idealist starts from a universal mind. So how can you account for at least the fact that different people seem to have private minds? They can't read each other's thoughts. They don't know what's going on in the galaxy of Andromeda. That's the decomposition problem. Unlike the other two, I maintain that there is a process in nature, an empirically verified process, that does exactly what we needed to do in order to explain the decomposition phenomenon, how one mind seemingly become many. And that's the psychiatric phenomenon known as dissociation. With the advent of neuroimaging in the 21st century, we know dissociation does happen. It's not a lie. It is literally blinding. If you have a dissociated alter in control, in executive control, that is blind, then you become literally blind in the sense that there is no brain activity on the visual cortex, even though the host personality sees perfectly and, and the eyes are open. And we know that different alters in the mind of a person with dissociation can interact, see, talk, even club each other over the head when the person is dreaming. Different alters partake in the same dream from different points of view, expressing themselves as different dream characters. So I use all this empirical knowledge to say dissociation happens in a human mind. Dissociation also happens at another level. It's the level of the universal mind. And what we are dissociated alters. We are dissociated personalities of the universal mind. And what that dissociation process looks like, the diagnostics image of it, is metabolism, living bodies.
Yeah, I mean, just to stress the power of dissociation. I mean, another example in the multiple personality disorder, which I remember reading, was how one personality was diabetic and another personality wasn't. I mean, it really is very, very pronounced. In a way, what I wanted to was to just sort of see whether the idea works in other directions. Because, for example, as a psychotherapist, dissociation is one of the things which, you know, you'll work with people. Sometimes it's very pronounced, very profound, like multiple personalities. At other times it's much more, say, you know, to do with trauma, not being able to remember, that kind of thing. And sometimes it's just not being able to focus very well. So it's a very pervasive idea. But do you see other ideas which, certainly in psychotherapy, so maybe the evidence base isn't quite so robust in the objective sense, like with dissociation, but, you know, maybe mechanisms like projection could have a part to play as well in this idealist account of our experience and becoming uncoupled from each other.
Well, almost by definition, it does, because, you know, as you guys know from clinical experience, the world in which we live in is not the world as it is actually displayed on the dashboard. There is a layer of projection on top of it. We all project. We are dancing with ourselves throughout life. We are dancing with aspects of ourselves that we don't recognize in ourselves. So you project in another, and you relate to those by proxy through projection. So in that psychological sense, I think it is. Whether there is a deeper metaphysical meaning to it, I never thought of it. I never really thought more deeply about it. Maybe.
I mean, one possibility I've wondered about is the business of manifestation, of incarnation, that they are, as it were, all sorts of different, the variety of religious experience, for example, you might account for as projections onto the divine. And they would be fantasies, again, in Winnicott's sense rather than Freud's. So Freud thought that, you know, we're kind of fantasy generating machines that just go on ad infinitum. But Donald Winnicott, this sort of post-Freudian, I think actually quite influenced by Jung indirectly as well, actually. But he said, look, they can't just be sheer fantasies, these projections, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to communicate at all. We'd all just be kind of crazy, not just building castles in the air, but living in them too. So some of these projections must connect with reality as such. And we know that because we feel grounded, because, as it were, they take us somewhere. In Coleridge's sense, this would be imagination rather than fantasy, because they're creative and they help us to build a sense of things that lasts, that develops, that expands, and so on. So, you know, the projection might be a way of understanding the connections across reality, if dissociation is a way of understanding the disconnections.
That is very interesting. So you mean we might be projecting essentially similar mythology onto our different religious experiences?
Yeah. So we have kind of collective projections as much as we, you know, have. Well, I suspect we're much more likely to have collective projections, because true originality is, even in psychotic states, doesn't really occur very much. That's why psychosis is so scary, actually, because you can relate to it. If you couldn't relate to it at all, it wouldn't be unsettling to be around. Yeah, so there's something collective in our projections, much like, but that reconnects, you know, rather than the dissociation that disconnects.
I think that's entirely plausible. I also think that the opposite effect is plausible too. Like you can project elements of your own culture or your own particular narrative about what reality is onto what would otherwise be identical religious experiences, and they come out with completely different descriptions, because one projected the Christ, the other one projected Krishna, and the atheist projected the dead grandmother. So I think it could work both ways, but it's an intriguing idea. I mean, I'm making this stuff up as I'm saying now, because as I told you, I never thought more deeply about this. But if I try to think more along the lines you were thinking, we tend to anthropomorphize the divine a lot. The Western God is a white man with a beard. I'm sure that the god of the horses would be a horse with a long tail. But could there be something more fundamental, something more essential in that seemingly nonsensical projection? As the Bible says, we were made in the image of God. So in what sense are we the image of God? Is it in the naive sense that God is also a person? Or is it in a more sophisticated sense that God is also a mind?
Yeah, I mean, my sense there would be that if one could talk to the horse about the horse's projection, the divine projected horse, say they would describe it as beautiful. Now, you might disagree a lot about what is actually the content of beauty, but you can still have a discussion about how beautiful it was. So within the various projections, it's possible to talk about the variety, put it like that. Again, you know, there's something that can be shared even across the difference, which suggests that some level of something's shared.
I'm totally with you there.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it sort of connects immediately to for instance, the near-death experience literature, which I'm not an expert on. But if you read it even casually, you see that although the descriptions are on the surface completely different, they all have the same underlying themes: warmth, comfort, acceptance, love, or light. Even more specific themes. They seem to be shared across all of those narratives. So yeah, maybe there is something there. Yeah.
And the other motivating factor for me, you know, when I was thinking about what you say and whether I can, you know, relate it to my experiences, that if dissociation is what separates us, it's quite common in wisdom or spiritual traditions for it to be said that that which separates is also that which reconnects. You know, so in Dante, the descent is part of the ascent. In fact, that's what you realize. And, you know, one way of explaining that is that it's about kind of letting go of what you thought you knew in order to be able to see far more. But you also need to have what you thought you know, because that's how you learn to know, if you like. You know, so you do need both mechanisms. And
that's very rich what you just said.
Right, yeah. You know, and it's not just in Christianity as well. I don't know, in Sufism, for example, someone like Ibn Arabi would say that actually, when you're walking, he would, you know, put it in quite straightforwardly divine terms. But when you're walking away from the divine, you're actually walking towards the divine still, because you're discovering the extent of the divine. So you're discovering another aspect of the divine, even as you feel that you're walking away. So yeah, again, there's this sort of third thing that starts to show up when you think more profoundly about these mechanisms and what's going on.
So going away is reconnecting, but you needed that dissociation because you first need to know what to know is.
Yeah, and again, you know, that would be, sorry, so do you want to say more? Yeah.
No, it was just that.
I mean, that links back to Barfield, you know, where we began too, because for Barfield, the alienation of the modern world has meaning. It's not just a kind of an unhappy event that might just sort of spiral completely out of control. Its meaning is that we are in a way forced onto ourselves some more. So we have to develop our individuality all that more. And you might say that, for example, in the modern world, the recognition that all human beings have individuality, not just sort of elite men, as might have been the case in previous times. So it has these kind of benefits that then actually enrich our participation with the divine. So the alienation is itself, in fact, a process of enrichment too.
That's very interesting, and it does resonate with me, and it seems to dovetail nicely with Jung as well.
Oh, so say more about that. Yeah, that's interesting.
The process of individuation.
Right. Okay.
Because at the same time, you know, when he talks about individuation, Jung seems to be talking in a paradoxical sense, because on the one hand, it's about you as an individual, not immersed in the mass mind. On the other hand, it's about you reconnecting with the contents of the unconscious, including the collective unconscious, which is then collective. So there is this side of individuation as a restriction, but running along with it, and as important as it, there is this side of individuation as a broadening of one's sense of identity. That's everywhere in Jung. Even the name, the process of individuation, becoming an individual, but connected to the collective, because that's where the primary archetypes are. And individuation is about bringing those collective aspects to conscious awareness or meta-conscious or metacognition.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you're making me think there. There was a point you made earlier on, but Jung makes it as well about the difference between completion and perfection, and how actually completion is a sort of a richer state of affairs than perfection, which is
Yeah,
trying to just split things off. In fact, yeah,
another way to look at it is you can be completely non-individuated. In other words, you don't have individual boundaries. You're part of nature, but you don't know that you are that. You are lacking that metacognitive awareness, because you're immersed in what Jung would call the flow of instinct. So when you're fully immersed in the flow of instinct, you are everything, but you don't know that you are everything. And to know that you are everything, first you have to become an individual, separate from the rest. So meta consciousness arises, which Jung called consciousness alone. You become aware of yourself. Your conscious activity is now under deliberate control of a will, and you can report on it. You're metacognitive of it. But then after you have formed this extra layer of cognition, this meta level of cognition, starting from a very restricted boundary, through the process of individuation, you start enlarging it again until you're again the whole. But now you know that you are that.
yeah. I mean, I think that's again, very rich, dynamic insight, and again, you see it in different traditions. Makes me think of I don't know, the role of crisis and bewilderment actually in religious traditions. So, the Sufi mystic often actually it's almost the final stage. You might think it would be an earlier stage, feeling bewildered, feeling alienated, thinking, this is a load of rubbish, but it's actually the penultimate stage, because in a way they have to, the goal, the path of the mystic is to become as rich as possible as a human being, and then let that go in order that as a human being, though, it's possible to appreciate the divine insofar as that is possible.
So St. John's Dark Night of the Soul.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a late stage rather than an early stage, and I think sometimes we kind of forget that.
That's reassuring, especially when we're suffering a lot, which happens a lot.
Yeah, but so I mean, again, that's the would be the theme, say, to draw on a bit of Indian philosophy, the theme of non-attachment. Arjuna learns in the Bhagavad Gita that the suffering actually is, and you have to be careful how you say this, because it so easily becomes a kind of masochism, or seems dismissive, but it's the reminder almost of the divine connection, and because it compels the metacognitive thought, the experience of seeing things from, well, a bit of Latin would be sub specie aeternitatis, and it's sort of part of the tragedy, perhaps, of the human condition, that we need that suffering in order to get there. But I mean, I know you talk very movingly about suffering yourself and how that has come about, really.
Jung, again, Jung hints at it. Well, he more than hinted it in Answer to Job towards the end. He says that maybe the service we render to God is that through our suffering, through our impotence, through being confronted with an external world much more powerful than we are, and being sort of submitted by it, we have to stop and think. We have to take account at a metacognitive level of what's going on, and that the divinity, because it's never faced with insurmountable obstacles or suffering, it never gets the impetus to stop and think about what's going on. It's just flowing with instinct, because it never faces that impassable obstacle that forces you to, oh, wait a moment, what's happening here? What is that? Who am I? What am I doing here? It doesn't have occasion for that. And through our suffering, we do. So it is through us that we render to God the service of metacognizing, of, or in more popular terms, self-awareness.
Yeah. I mean, again, I have the queries about Jung's conclusions there, which you'll know about, but I don't want to spoil the profound sense in which suffering can have meaning, if one dare even says it, because again, as a psychotherapist, well, in some ways, you see, as a psychotherapist, what you offer to people is you come to me suffering, and I believe there's meaning in it, even if you don't. And I will hold the place that this can be understood whilst we reach the point, and while we go through that process, which may take a long, long time, in fact. So, you know, it's actually a very practical insight as well in the mental health field.
And that's a very Jungian position, Mark, to see suffering not as a disease, but as part of the process of maturation and individuation.
Yeah. Look, maybe just one sort of final area domain for now, just to at least touch on, because it's something that comes up quite often in your conversations, and so I just wanted to air it here now, which is to do with freedom and the nature of freedom. And it's come to my mind because it's related to what we've just been touching about, because I feel that really the nature of human freedom isn't actually freedom of expression, as if, you know, unrestrained expression is a kind of an ideal of freedom, valuable though that is. It's, you know, in the Isaiah Berlin distinction, it would be confusing freedom from with freedom for, and I think we need a kind of freedom for to be fully human. But neither is it just you know, being able to make completely random choices, because we just can't. You know, you only had to reflect for a moment to realize that's so. But where I wonder whether our freedom really lies actually is with our intentionality. It is with our inner life that we can, even in dire situations, in principle at least, you know, in practice it takes training to get there with this, but the mind can choose to understand, interpret, relate to whatever happens, again, in principle, freely. That is something which we can cultivate. And so in the spirit of your getting empirical hints and nudges about the nature of the divine as well, maybe that's something about the divine freedom as well in that. It's freedom in the mind's eye that is then reflected, is then a reflection of the freedom in mind at large, you might say.
You're leaning compatibilism here. Again, it's extremely rich territory as well, free will. And I think under mainstream physicalism, I think most people would say, well, if that's true, I don't have free will, because what I think is my will, or my decisions, my choices, my preferences are determined by a material substrate, because all of that is generated by matter under physicalism. Now, I deny physicalism completely. I think I would bet my life on physicalism not being true, because it's just internally inconsistent. It fails the empirical test. It fails the parsimony test. I mean, it fails everything. It's just the worst option on the table. So I would eliminate that hypothesis about there not being free will. But if you dig deeper into why we think that if we are really material beings in the physicalist sense, we wouldn't be free, the reason for that is that it would mean that our choices are being forced on us by something that we don't identify ourselves with. So our choices are determined, but they are not determined by us. Why does that work does it work like this under physicalism? Because for the life of us, we do not identify with neurons in a wet brain. We understand conceptually there is a brain, I have a brain, and if it's damaged, I am in trouble. But for the life of us, we can't think of being the brain. We think we have a brain. We don't think we are the brain. We think we have a body. What we really think as ourselves is our conscious inner life. So could it be that under idealism, there is another form of saying that we are not really free? I would say there is. Because under idealism, the parts of mind that we identify with are the parts that are, one, metacognitive. In other words, the experiences that we not only experience, but that we know that we experience. And whatever is associated with it, but not what is inferentially dissociated from it. What we identify with is a particular web of cognitive associations, a web of meaning that is experiential in nature, and we are metacognitive of it. We re-represent those experiences internally in a self-reflective manner. So it's a very narrow area of mind, we call it the ego, that we really identify with. So if our choices are being made by another part of our minds that is dissociated from us, or not metacognitive, then we are still not free. And I happen to think that from this perspective, most of what we do is not free. I don't think we are free to choose our professions. I think we are not free to choose our partners. We may be free to choose a mortgage package or the better way to work in the morning, given the traffic situation. But the big things, I think I visualize the ego as a small boat in the middle of a raging ocean with a hurricane and a storm. And we are there rowing our small boat, think that we are going in the direction that we row. No, no, no. It's those impersonal or transpersonal currents of life, of nature, that are manifesting through you. And I call those forces the daimon in good Socratic tradition. I call, or Neoplatonic tradition also, I call these forces the daimon, those aspects of our minds that we don't identify with, but which govern our lives. They determine our destiny. And to me, my human freedom, and I found that out only recently in my life, I'll be 47 years old this year. My freedom consists in either fighting the daimon and losing, or accepting my condition of a slave to the daimon, not fighting it. And what will happen will be the same. It's just that in one case I suffer more. Know what I mean? So did I choose to be a philosopher? No, I had no interest in being a philosopher. If you ask my ego, is it nice to be a semi-public figure? Absolutely not. I don't like it. Do I like the conclusions of idealism? No, I put a brave face on it with meaning, but I don't like the idea that subjectivity is eternal. I find the experience, what I feel from the inside when I really absorb that notion, when I let it sink in, is what I call the vertigo of eternity. It's beyond scaring. It's terrible. And I don't like it. So if you ask my ego, my little ego, what my plans were, no, I was the youngest director in a Europe top 50 company when I was 32. My ego's goal was to be the CEO right now and still be playing with technology and science, having fun, and not be a public figure, not be defending this stuff I'm defending, writing books, which are like long deliveries, long births, very painful, extremely exhausting, taxing. I don't like any of this business, but I don't fight it. Now, there's another sense in which I don't think our will is free, which is we don't get to choose what we want. Our wants are a function of what we are. Otherwise, we would all be perfectly happy people. We would just choose to want exactly what we happen to have. So if you're locked up doing a life sentence in prison in a 3x4 cubicle in a small window, you'd just choose that that's what you want, and you would be in nirvana. So as Schopenhauer said, you don't will what you will. So there's a literal sense in which there is no free will. But I think insofar as we are the universal mind, and I think our core subjectivity is universal mind, insofar as we are that, there are no external forces. So in that sense, we are free to act according to the universal will, or to act according to what the daimon wants, to act according to what nature wants through you. If you identify yourself with the whole of nature, then you are free to act as you want. Although even then, even as God, you are not free to want what you want, because what you want is a function of what you are, and you can't be other than what you are.
Well, I guess that's where the things come together. But there is this extra element, and you know, in a way, you're nicely touching on a lot of the themes there that we've discussed and bringing them together, because it seems to me that the daimon, it doesn't just want you to do what it says. It wants everything that you are in participation, in co-creativity with it. You know, so for you, Bernardo Kastrup, it wants everything that happened in that old life in the computer company in order to have the conversations like we've had today, to give your all to it. So there's it's kind of, and your freedom there is to cooperate and to become co-creative with what is wanted.
You're absolutely right. I think that, I mean, and I can say this with authority because you're talking about my particular example. So yes, nature, what nature wanted through me until that point was exactly what was happening. But my ego was very satisfied with that. So when the time came to say, okay, now you need to abandon this because you've done what you needed to do. Now you have the tools you need. Now, now we have to go do the real thing. I went through that kicking and screaming. I mean, when I gave notice, I was almost crying when I gave notice. I had a lot of trouble living that life. It was irresistible. I knew it was futile to resist it because by the time I was already very cognizant of how the daimon operates, how nature operates through you. And I already knew in my body how futile it is to try to muscle yourself against that. It just doesn't work, just makes you suffer more. But I was not a happy camper. It was a very, very difficult transition to make. Um,
Yeah,
Still
well,
is.
I mean, I can share some of that. I mean, as I mentioned right at the get-go, as an undergraduate, I did a physics degree, and then I segued and became actually a priest. I became a clergyman, and then that went horribly wrong. But it did get me doing some theology, you see. So now I can feel that. And then I went off searching for another framework and got to Plato, did the PhD and all that. But it kind of, I didn't quite know why. But not until I was about, I'd say, well, it was past my 35th year, past my midlife. In fact, in the 3 school years in 10, did it start to come together in some way, insofar as it has. But you're right about the kicking and screaming and anxiety and God knows what on the way as well. Yeah, yeah,
The image I have sometimes, Mark, and it's not consistent with what I just said, not entirely consistent, but it's an image I often have. The image I have is that in the first part of my life, I was sort of in the collective of nature, didn't have a specific purpose. It was just sort of the training ground, which is rather collective. And then at some point, some part of nature was like, okay, now we want to explore this now, but it has to be through someone who knows a little bit of this, knows a little bit of that, has this kind of openness, has this kind of experience. And then they looked around and I was passing by and they saw me and they thought, oh, that kid would do. And from that point on, no freedom, none whatsoever. Nothing I do, I register. The only freedom I feel is what I told you, is the freedom of the slave, which is a big freedom. When you surrender to that impersonal force, there is freedom in that. There is a release, and that release comes in the form of, if this goes wrong, it's not my fault. I didn't plan this shit. Know what I mean?
yeah,
I'm providing a service here. I'm not responsible for the final outcome. I need to do my job, and I'll freely do my job. And if it's for nothing, it all goes to hell. But not my problem. Know what I mean? I was a means to an end, and there is release to that. Yeah, there is. I will not hide that from you. That freedom of the slave is substantial. It's not just an abstraction.
yeah. And maybe the freedom is the freedom that comes of being in the service of what you're trying to articulate, what we've been talking about, because they feel like liberating thoughts. To go right back to the beginning, Barfield sensed that the problem of our times is we've become imprisoned by these narrow metaphors that we're trying to use to describe reality, and we need to test them, to push them, to explode them, to bring in other ones, and that is a kind of freedom in itself as well. Look, maybe that's a good point to draw things to a close. Thank you very much indeed. I hope maybe we can talk some more, because
Sure, it has been a
this is part of
great
the freedom. These
conversation.
things expand and grow, don't they?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I love it that it was not an interview, that I just got to talk to somebody. I've been tired of interviews, if I may be so honest. And I enjoyed it a lot because it wasn't an interview, it was a conversation. So be glad to
Yeah.
do this again if you like.
Yeah, well, look, thank you for, I mean, I've been watching what you're doing for a long time, and so it's really great to air some of the thoughts that I've been having, whilst listening in. Just tell people about the Essentia Foundation and so on, just so they can follow things up in that way.
So we started a foundation whose aim is to show that idealism, the notion that reality is fundamentally mental, not only in your mind alone or my mind alone, but a transpersonal, spatially extended form of mind, This is called idealism. Our mission is to show that we do already have very strong rational analytical reasons and very strong mainstream empirical evidence from foundations of physics and neuroscience of consciousness to already today make a very well-informed decision that idealism is the best option on the table as far as the nature of reality is concerned. Not because we meditated it or because we were revealed this in visions, but because we studied the literature, we are looking at the data, we are making very rational arguments, and that's the sole conclusion that we think is tenable. Nothing against the meditators, nothing against the spiritual people, much to the contrary, but the whole that we want to cover is to say that it's not only spirituality that leads you to a universal mind, it's hardcore, hard-nosed, analytic reasoning and laboratory empirical evidence. And even if you did not have the spiritual side, you would still have more than enough to extract that conclusion and say, this is the best and only tenable game in town. So that's what you're trying to do.
Yeah, well, I'll put details of that in the show notes, as they say, and do follow that up. And, you know, it's as we would expect that actually, whilst you're doing the work in the scientific domain, of course, it would resonate with other domains too, if the picture that you're painting is true as well, that it's all a variety of participations.
Yeah, truth is not fragile.
Yeah. Very good. Well, that's a tremendous point to finish. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Mark. It's been a pleasure.